How about now? Now is there audio? Hopefully now there's audio. That was kind of embarrassing. I've done this before. I really do promise that. So, as I was saying, welcome back to my personal channel. This is the monthly members question and answer. Why is it still doing? Wait, no, there should be audio now. There's definitely audio now. Okay, so there's audio now. Yeah, monthly members question and answer live stream. As a show of appreciation for the members who help support this channel, every single month I do this live stream where I take questions from the members of the channel and answer them. If you'd like to ask me a question, then consider joining this channel as a member. Otherwise, feel free to hang out and listen and hear the answers to some of the questions other members have asked. I'm going to start with the questions that were already asked on the post I put up yesterday. Meanwhile, if anyone else in here has any other questions, feel free to hop in and add them in the chat. So add any questions you have in the chat, so I'll have those once I get through the ones that were already asked on the post yesterday. So let's start off. And I think most of these are going to be from our friend Historic History, who's also hanging out in the chat right now. So that's good. Historic History asked about the current state of Bitcoin City. For those who don't know, Bitcoin City was an ill-fated project from the government of El Salvador that was supposed to build a city on a volcano funded by the volcano bond, which besides being used to purchase or to build this city and establish a geothermal energy place, was also going to be used to buy Bitcoin. That bond is no more. The city has been canceled. The geothermal energy project does seem to be going forward, but instead of a debt offering, they now seem to be doing a private equity offering, and it's unclear which entities are going to be supporting it. Though if I had to guess, it's Tether. And so yeah, the volcano city in El Salvador is not happening. The volcano bond in El Salvador seems like it's probably not happening and is instead going to be this kind of private equity offering. There are still a lot of municipal and government employees in El Salvador who are not getting paid, which suggests they're still at danger of defaulting when their next debt payment comes due. For anyone here who has a lot of interest in learning more about El Salvador and what's going on there with Bitcoin, as Historic History mentioned in the comment, we've had on several Salvadorans to discuss this on my cryptocurrency podcast, Crypto Critics Corner. So if you'd like to check that out, I'm going to throw a link to a playlist about El Salvador in the chat. So feel free to take a look at that, see what you can learn about what's going on in El Salvador and with the Bitcoin city. But yeah, most basic version of the update is the city seems to not currently be happening. The bond seems to not currently be happening. The payment of Salvadoran municipal officials seems not to be happening. Really, all the things that are supposed to be happening are not happening, and all the things that are not supposed to be happening are happening. So, perfect. That's exactly how we hope things are going. So Historic History asked if we would ever do kind of a Where Are They Now style recap video for things that we've covered on Crypto Critics Corner. And I could see us doing that. We've definitely earned a few victory laps at this point, I'd say. Specifically, Historic History referenced an episode related to Genesis, where we were pushing someone on how they earned the yield for their product. Now, this was not someone from Genesis. The episode in question was when we were interviewing Mario Gibney, who worked at the time for cryptocurrency lending company Ledin, which, yes, is a dumb name, but hey, I didn't pick it. And at one point, Cass is pushing Mario on, okay, so you're paying this yield back to customers. Where is that coming from? And the answer from Mario effectively was, we give it to Genesis and they give us the yield. And Cass's response was something like, oh, so you just give it over, no questions asked? And he said, yeah, basically. And then after that, Genesis went bankrupt and a bunch of other things. So that was this really kind of striking moment in this one interview. Now, according to Ledin, they had stopped using Genesis shortly before Genesis closed withdrawals, but there's certainly some problems that I could see there. So I'm going to throw a link to that interview in the chat as well for you guys to check that out. The Historic History asked me if I've ever played Fear and Hunger or its sequel Termina. That was like one of the first God games, wasn't it? Fear and Hunger, like by what's his face? No, I've never played Fear and Hunger, and I was thinking of the wrong game when I looked it up. So no, I have never played either of those games. I've played a few RPGs at this point, but I don't play a ton of video games, and when I do, ever since Souls games became a thing, a lot of RPGs that are aiming for that more brutal mark tend to also rely on pretty quick reflexes and other things which I just don't have. And so I generally don't play those. It's why you'll also like probably never see me streaming or playing any of like the Souls games. I just don't have the reflexes or the hand-eye coordination to make that an enjoyable experience. In a similar vein, Historic History asked me if I have played either Baldur's Gate 1 or 2. And I think part of the reason that Historic History is asking this is because over on my Dungeons and Dragons channel, which is linked in the description, and I'm going to link in the chat, I have been streaming some Baldur's Gate 3. But to answer just the straightforward and basic form of the question here, no, I have not played Baldur's Gate 1 or 2. I have been having quite a lot of fun with Baldur's Gate 3 recently, and go subscribe to my Dungeons and Dragons channel if you'd be interested in ever catching out one of those streams or something. But yeah, I haven't played either of the first ones, don't have any well-developed opinions on them. Again, I'm not a super huge gamer. Baldur's Gate 3 just was such a sensation and is using a rule set I'm already familiar with and I already make content about, so it seemed like a really easy one, and I have been really enjoying it. So I might do more things like that as I go through. Historic History also mentioned that Fear and Hunger is turn-based, which does make it more appealing to me. Turn-based is easier because I don't need my reflexes, but I don't have any familiarity, and it's going to take me dozens of more hours spread out over at least a couple months to get through Baldur's Gate, so we're not going to really explain that for a long time. Sure, Fran, I can give a little bit of information on my background. Fran asked, how did I get into investigative reporting? My story is a little weird. In undergrad, I majored in biochemistry with a goal of going to graduate school, ideally at an MD PhD program. I had a specific interest in drug discovery and design. My work, especially my senior year of college, was heavily focused in for opiates. I was doing a lot of work on opiates, opiate analogs. Specifically, I had an idea that intravenously injected opiates of a specific shape, targeting oligomers of the mu and delta tetramer, could potentially induce an analgesic effect with less of a physical dependency reaction and hopefully less of an addiction liability. So that was that. I applied to 14 MD PhD programs, got rejected from 14 MD PhD programs. And the fun thing about applying to MD PhD programs is after they reject you from the MD PhD program, they consider you for the MD program and the PhD program. And during college, I was both a heavy drinker, a football player, and someone with a masochistic desire to take like the hardest classes I could. And so because of that, I only had like a 3.1, and my MCAT was good. I was in like, I want to say the 78th percentile, but wasn't good enough to make up for the fact that my GPA was a 3.1. So I got rejected from all 14 MD PhD programs, and then all 14 MD programs, and then all 14 PhD programs. So after 42 rejection letters from that, I had to kind of reassess my path. Applied to 3 different master's programs and eventually ended up getting a master's in biomedical informatics at the University of Chicago after I graduated. This was way easier than undergrad. Like the classes, like getting A's in my classes for my master's degree, even at this like Ivy League, was way easier than undergrad. And so I did that for a year, graduated, and now my GPA was high enough that I could have realistically gotten into MD PhD programs. But I was in a place where I was so burnt out that the idea of committing to 6 to 10 more years of schooling was overwhelming. It was not something I was willing to do. So I started applying for jobs. I eventually got a job as a data scientist at a boutique consulting firm that does fraud, waste, and abuse work for pharmacy benefit managers. And so in that role, I was the only data scientist at the firm, and I completely redesigned and rebuilt our entire fraud detection algorithm, our front end for it, redeployed it for multiple clients, did all this. But I was, again, after about like 2 years there, I was getting pretty burnt out. It was a lot of work. I needed probably more support than I had at it because it was a really small firm, and I just didn't have the skills to really keep up with it and manage it. During this period, I had been podcasting for Crypto Critics Corner. I had been blogging about cryptocurrency on my website, and towards kind of the end of my period at this data science firm, Cass had this idea for a podcast, Innovated Blockchain City, which he pitched to Protos, where he was already doing a little bit of writing, and they were interested in funding it. So I came on part-time to consult on a couple of investigative pieces they were working on and co-host this podcast. We did this podcast, which I will link in the chat, and it went pretty well. A few months later, I was still considering kind of what I wanted to do next in my career. And Protos was interested in both Cass and I after we had created this podcast, doing more. And so they offered us positions. Originally, the idea was we were going to kind of co-lead investigations, but how we've ended up dividing it up and like what our titles are now is Cass is head of investigations and I'm head of research. We collaborate on a lot of pieces. The idea of the Protos newsroom is that a lot of these things are meant to be kind of collaborative products of the newsroom as a whole. And so, yeah, a year ago, almost exactly, I switched from being a data scientist to being head of research at this crypto media company. And that's how I've made the transition and what I've been doing for the last year. It's not a conventional path to get to this point. I will say that much. Historic History asked if I would ever consider going back to school for a PhD. Oh yeah, I would absolutely consider it. I would say I regularly consider it. Like, there is now kind of like a part of me that knows that I could most likely do it. But kind of my challenge at this point is my expertise that I developed in undergrad was all related to like kind of this very specific thing, the intuition and the skills I developed for that were related to kind of this pretty specific thing. And so because of that, I'm reasonably confident I could get accepted into a biochemistry or a funded drug discovery and design PhD. The problem is I'm no longer sure that's what I want to do, or like that's what I would want to do if I wanted to commit 4 to 8 years to research, And a lot of the things I would be potentially interested in researching, certain historical questions, economic questions, like some of these things that sit at like these kind of weird intersections and things like that, I'm by most measures not qualified for, right? Like I don't have an undergraduate degree in a lot of the things that like I now do or now study or I'm now interested in, which makes the process of getting the funded PhD a little bit harder and a little bit more challenging. So it's certainly a thing I consider. The other reason I kind of hold back on it is just a PhD is a really huge commitment, and congratulations on almost being at the end of it in historic history. That's a big deal. Any kind of doctorate, just you are committing several years of your life to learning one thing. And I'm really bad at committing myself to learn just one thing. When I was a data scientist working on pharmacy fraud, I couldn't help myself from committing a decent portion of my time to trying to learn about cryptocurrencies and cryptocurrency fraud. And now that my job is cryptocurrency fraud, I can't help myself from in my free time trying to make videos and other content about things that aren't cryptocurrency fraud, right? I want to engage more in politics and in news and commentary and in non-crypto frauds and scams. The way my brain works, I make the most progress on learning when the learning is almost like it's not what I'm supposed to be doing, which is that. So yeah, those are some of the things that kind of go through my head when I think about PhDs. I think there are places where I could find a program that would make sense, but it's a lot of time commitment, and for someone who is somewhat public in the way I am, time commitments are an opportunity cost in terms of like income, career development, things like that. So yeah, it's always a thing I'm considering. Like every time when I start to get burnt out or tired or whatever, there's a part of me that goes, ooh, you should take the GRE again and send out a few applications. So yeah, that's kind of what goes through my head with thinking about PhDs and anything like that. I'm going to give like 60 seconds here for any final questions. Fran, I'll say, yeah, it was really great to go on Coffee's channel, and we got to have coffee on our channel before. That was great. And Molly's wonderful. Every time I get to work with Molly or talk to Molly about something in cryptocurrency, it is just great. Yeah, historic history, your point there about long-term crypto is going to crash. This is a this is a conversation Cass and I have actually had recently where we were talking about the podcast and like in a situation where crypto continues to exist, but say at 1/50th of the average interest that it is now, right? Where it's primarily this project for a few weirdos. What does that kind of mean? And what does that look like for us? And so we've talked about like, do we launch another podcast? Do we launch a separate YouTube channel? Do we each kind of have our own channels and see if we can figure out a way to collaborate on them often? Do we launch some kind of newsletter? And like, where do we target? What do we do? Do we try to go broader financial scam and fraud? Can we cover broader financial scam and fraud under like the Crypto Critics Corner brand? And so, yeah, the what happens to my career if crypto crashes is one of those things that kind of goes through my head. I'm lucky in the fact that I've kind of made my brand as a skeptic and a critic and someone who has often correctly predicted the crash, which means even now as things are crashing, there's a lot of interest in some of my expertise because people want to discuss what led us to this point and why things are playing out the way they do. So in many crash scenarios, there's a part of me that hopes I would be able to effectively parlay it to cover kind of a lot of the period of the crash, to either what went wrong, what happened, consult people who need to talk about those kind of things. Cass and I have several chapters of a Tether book that we started writing in early 2018. We haven't finished that book or tried to sell it yet because we don't want to be pressured to publish it until we feel like we have the ending for it. So that's the thing I might do if there was ever a really big crash. There's lots of things like that that go through my head, and yeah, PhD programs are one of them. And I appreciate that offer historic history. And also, I did really, really, really well on the GRE, like really well. So even if it's not needed, I would do it because it would make it more likely for them to consider me. Yeah. So I think with that, thank you all for joining me for this stream today. Check out some of those links I mentioned while we were talking. I added a bunch of them in the chat here. And yeah, thank you all for joining.